Hi, this is Amanda, and I am doing my presentation, and I've titled the presentation, What's the MO? Evaluating Policy. So our agenda for today is I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, tell you a little bit about flipped classroom. Then I'm going to synthesize the Ball, Munford, and Alexander chapter 12. And we're going to conclude with chapter 13. And then I'm going to remind you of your class credit for tonight. So this is considered to be a flipped classroom. It is originally something that was introduced to me as a classroom teacher where I could record myself in some way teaching. I'm using an app right now called Explain Everything, and that's what's allowing me to upload my Google Slides into the app and record over each of my individual slides. One of the really cool things about the Explain Everything app is that there's also features and tools that you can't see, but that I can see that would allow me to highlight. I could write on the slide. I could use a shape and draw a shape over a certain section of the slide in order to highlight something that I'm speaking about. I have used these in several different ways. Sometimes I use them like click sheets to help my teachers navigate through a specific program or task that I need them to complete. I've also used this both by myself with the counselors and then also the specialist to present important information to the teachers where we don't have to have another meeting to go through slides that have very specific verbiage and don't really allow for us to have kind of conversation because it's things that I really just need to disseminate to the staff. What I'll usually do in those cases is I'll follow up with a Google form, kind of like a quiz, and it is their electronic signature saying that they watched the presentation, and that allows me just to document that the information had been disseminated and that the teacher signed off that they saw the presentation as well. So tonight I'm using this as a way to present to you all. I have included in here different reflection questions and also activities that I would have done live with you. I've included these because as part of our class credit, you all do need to write a one-page reflection for Dr. Alaman. So I kept those in there, the reflection questions and activities, in order for you to be able to use any or all of those to help you with your reflection for Dr. Alaman tonight. So that was the purpose. That is the purpose, rather, of the reflection questions and the activities continuing to be embedded in this presentation, even though you are most likely watching this by yourself. So we are going to go ahead and get started. As I was reading through the information, I really started to see a common theme through the Ball, the Mumford, and chapter 12. And I really started thinking about motivation. That kind of became the theme in my mind to these three, or the two articles and the chapter, which is why I titled the presentation, What's the MO, right? So what the MO, the motivation. And in my mind, I kind of started to see kind of an outline, or I guess what I have called the formula, that I could see that was very common in all of these in three pieces. And what I saw was that the who plus the why equaled the action. And I'm going to go and explain that more and break that down into each of these three pieces a little bit more. So first, when looking at the Ball et al. Article, I immediately saw that some of the who's that came out to me were the teacher. They talked about senior leadership team, or the SLT, they said several times throughout this article. They also talked about local authority and advisors as well. They also started to talk about their positions and their power. I'm not sure that this was necessarily explicitly talked about in Ball. However, I started to relate their positions and their power to this article from our conversations in class, and also looking critically at the different articles. Whenever you start to talk about, or the author started to talk about in the article, teachers, but then quickly within the first couple paragraphs started to separate out senior leadership teams, you're automatically starting to talk about different positions within the educational system. And with those positions often comes power. I would venture to say it always comes with power. Or at least perceived power. So multiple times throughout my presentation, you'll hear me say perceived power. And so that could be from the perception of the person who is holding that position. What do they perceive their power to be? And then also the people who surround them and are interacting and engaging with the different policies and kind of this formula that I set out of who plus Y equals their action. What are their perceptions of the other individual's power as well? I think we see that even more so when we get to the Montfort article, where they talk about the relationships between the superintendent and the school board. And we really see the perception of power both from the individual and then also how they perceive the power of their other board members as well, regardless of if they were the superintendent or another one of the elected positions of the board member. So here when I look at action, I'm looking at how is the person engaged with policy. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about their actions. We're going to go ahead and take different pieces from Ball's article. I think that Ball really gives some explicit examples that fit very nicely into this formula. So one of the actors that Ball talks about is the narrator. So that is one of the people that he describes. So the why. So what is the reason that the narrator is going to engage in policy? It's because they want to narrate, they want to select, they want to interpret that policy. So their action is that they are the person that's going to be holding things together. They're going to be moving things on. So that's their role, and that's how they choose to engage in that policy. So let's look at another one of the examples from Ball. So here we have the entrepreneur. So their why is that they want to be agents of change. They're invested in some change that they want to see. They're identifying with some part of that policy. And so their action and how they choose to engage in policy is going to be through advocacy and maybe even possibly producing original text about that policy. So the outsiders, their why is they really want to clarify their priorities. And so their action is that they're going to be interpreters. One of the things that's distinguished here is that that's where the who of the local authority and the advisors that you can see up here. So that local authority and the advisors really is what is being talked about with the outsiders here. And so again, their priority and their interpretation is all going to fit together. the transactors, they're really about checking that box and making sure that systems are complete. And so their action and how they're going to engage in policy is they're going to be the monitors, they're going to be the enforcers, they're going to be the accountants. Ball really talks about how the senior leadership often takes on this transactor role, especially in education, where we're sort of just making sure that boxes are checked and that we're enforcing the policy. This is what the policy says. This is what we need to do with the policy. We're monitoring the policy. We're accounting. In the terms of accounting, we're really talking about making sure our I's are dotted and our T's are crossed, that we're kind of following the rules. They're the ones that kind of make sure that we follow all of the rules. Ball talks a little bit about that position and that power in terms of the transactors and how teachers perceive the power and the position of the transactors as more oppressive, really pushing down those policies and enforcing those policies onto the teachers. Depending on how you interpret the article, the way that I read it is often what I hear teachers say in terms of their positionality is below or beneath the transactors or that senior leadership, and that senior leadership is exerting their power down onto the teachers. And so oftentimes the teachers at this point and this relationship are state that they are feeling powerless, so that they have less power than the transactors. So again, that perceived power. What we've talked about in class is that teachers probably have more power than they think that they do, but in this specific relationship, you have that perceived power of the teacher. So in the Ball article, he also talks about the enthusiasts, the translators, the critics, and the receivers. And so what I want you to do is I want you to think about those four roles as we move into the next slide, which is going to be some reflection questions for you. So again, we have these reflection questions. If I was presenting this live and we had an opportunity to talk with each other, these are some of the questions that I would ask you to talk with in your group, talk with your elbow partner, and then share out and have more class discussion. I left them in here again because you do need to type a one-page reflection for Dr. Alaman, and so I wanted to allow these to be in here for you in case you wanted to use any of these as prompts to help guide your reflection. So again, I want you to think about that enthusiast, the translator, the critic, and the receiver role. And I want you to think about how does their position and or their perceived power explain their why. So again, thinking about the formula that I kind of came up with in my head of the who plus the why equals the action. And then also thinking about how does the role and the why determine the action likely to be taken by the actor. And again, looking at this through Ball. So taking out those pieces of information and plugging those in. I also want you to think about just a general question. How does position and or power impact the who and the why? So for this, I gave you an example of the teacher and the transactor. So the teacher and the transactor. So the example that I gave you is based on those positions, the power and the perceived power, it impacts the who and the why, right? Because the senior leadership is the who and their perceived position is over the teachers. They are they have perceived power in order to enforce and monitor and check box, using policy like a checkbox down onto the teachers. Whereas the teacher's perceived power and their position, their perceived position is that they're oftentimes they talk about they feel like they're beneath senior leadership and feeling powerless. And so then that can change the teacher's why. If they feel like they're powerless, they're less likely to take on a role that is similar to the trans actors. Or maybe it, for some teachers, it could be something that motivates them in order to move into administration or a senior leadership position, such as one that might be at central office, looking at instructional coaches or our assistant superintendents. Having been in the teacher role may motivate them in order to take on a trans actor role as well. So I want you to think about some of those, the perceived positions, powers, and the who and the whys, and some of those different relationships. Next, I wonder are there any roles that Ball talks about that would be unethical for an employed public school teacher to hold? And then I have teacher underlined because then you could ask the same question and instead of teacher, administrator. Is there any role described by Ball in those policy actors that it would be unethical for an employed public school administrator to hold? And again, you can supplement board member or superintendent. Are any of those roles unethical? And if you think so, I wonder why you think that they would be unethical. What would make that unethical? So moving into our second piece, the Munford article, again, we're talking about the who plus the why equals the action. So within this article, it is a research article. It's a qualitative study. And near the beginning, they talk about motivation theory. So again, we're looking at this as a lens through motivation theory. So here, the who would be the humans. The why on page 707, they talk about that people are motivated by caste power and human motivation, and also power is expressed differently based on a person's motive. And so then they talk about that if somebody is more of the first bullet, their actions will probably be more altruistic, looking at influence and care of future generations. While if someone is more focused on power, then their actions and how they engage is more likely to be more personal, more dominant and oppressive, looking to fulfill their own needs, desires, or agendas. So next in the article, they kind of give us a historical view of some other studies that were done and some other findings of those studies. The majority of these studies looked at board members. At this point, they didn't really specify much between the community elected board members versus the superintendent. However, we can see that the why that they found was in 1955, many of the board members self-reported this need to fix. Whereas in 1959, just 4 years later, there's more of an interest in education and civic duty. In 1962, there's more personal vendettas. 1971, more self-interest. 1975, we have a personal interest, public duty, or some even reported that their motivation was neutral because they were just recruited, just asked to join by someone else. And so they just joined and they have self-reported neutral motivation. And in 1979, there was a finding that, again, these were from self-reports, problem solving, concern for education, and again, that they were recruited. But they also found that there was some ego there, fulfillment of the ego as well. At this point in the article, we really didn't, it didn't specify necessarily actions that would go with these, although I think that we can all infer what those actions may have been at those different timelines, especially looking at it from a historical view. We also need to take into context what was happening outside of education that could also be influences at each of these different timelines. So at the beginning of the research, they really were talking more about just leaders in general, and that the why was either because the leader wanted to have power over somebody, or they wanted to have power with somebody, or some kind of mixed combination of both. So somebody who was focused on motivation, had a motivation of power over, was really going to have actions that were very top down within the organization. Whereas someone who was motivated to have power with somebody, they were going to be seeking more collaborative actions. So the findings. The findings from the article were really, they started to split and look at the differences between those elected board members and the superintendents. Again, they found that there was no neutrals. So like was previously self-reported back in the historical, there really is no neutral, even for any of those board members who were recruited or superintendents who were recruited. They did not find that there was any kind of neutral motivation. So it was personal, altruistic, and mixed. And if you remember, also in the research, not only what made this research different was that not only did the board members and the superintendent self-report, but they also reported on their perceptions of each other as well. And so some of the actions that we would see is you might find someone who maybe sometimes has some frustrations over not feeling helpful, and that would really go more with the altruistic personality or motivation. Here you're going to see that if a person is more personally motivated by their own agenda, they're again going to be, their actions are going to be exerted through power over, and again that's going to be top down as well. Where an altruistic and a mixed, you're going to see a little bit more of that power with, more collaborative practices in working with each other, and there may be some frustrations over not feeling helpful of the altruistic as well. The article also talked about some different findings in terms of gender as well, and what a small percentage of females are board members and superintendents as well. However, male and female, you did still see that between that mix or the personal or the altruistic. Although they did say that the females tended to be less mixed and more one or the other on the spectrum of personally agenda motivated or altruistically motivated. So I did find that to be an interesting finding. So here are some reflection questions. In your experience, what behaviors do people who are motivated for strictly personal reasons exhibit? So what are those behaviors? And then also you can kind of reflect on what was the person's role and what was their perceived power, and then what was your role and your perceived power. So again, this is from your experience. Is it something that you observed, or is it something that maybe you personally, how there was a personal interaction with somebody else? And again, asking those same questions for people who are strictly motivated altruistically. And then the last question, in your opinion, is it possible for those who engage in policy to stay strictly focused on altruistic motives without ever adding in a personal motivation? And then why or why not? I wonder if it is possible. I thought about this question as I was doing the readings myself, as I was questioning, was it even possible? I really couldn't think of anybody, and really, truly, even myself, where I could say that they were strictly altruistic reasons and that it wasn't some mix. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more later when I ask some other reflection questions about why I believe that it's mixed. So then when we look at chapter 12 is all about having an evaluation plan. And here it's really what I thought about in terms of, this formula in my head of who plus why equals action. I feel like Ball and Munford really talk about the intended, right? Like what is intended for policy to happen based off of the who, the why, and the action. And what chapter 12 is asking us to do is compare the intended to the actual. And so I really liked this quote on page 187 that talked about, in creating an evaluation plan, you must ensure that evaluation reflects the allocation of power, strength, in relationships, as well as success of the programs. And so here I really felt like we're looking at what were the intended actors, their intended motivations, their actions, and did that equal or did that not equal what actually happened? So who was actually impacted, why they were actually impacted, and then the actions of what that looked like. And so I felt like with Alexander and the different, of course, she went through different ways that we could evaluate that. But I thought this quote on page 187 really summed up the evaluation plan or the evaluation process, and it matched kind of, again, what I felt like the themes were through these three pieces, which really was about that motivation piece. So here's an activity that we can do. So go ahead and take out the Texas Public Policy Foundation page. So it says on the top, the 2019 Liberty Action Agenda. So when we look through this, we can definitely see all the different policies that this organization is wanting to address. And so one of the ways that you could interact with this particular piece that ties together what we just talked about in the three other pieces is to pick one policy. Who are all the actors that would be related to this specific policy? So again, we know that this is at a state level. It's looking at Texas public policy. But we can really look at, kind of break down who are all the actors. And then looking at it from Ball's perspective, which of those roles do you think each of the actors would most identify with? And then thinking about what are their motivations? Are you able to distinguish those motivations between each of the actors? And then also looking at it, again, those same actors and motivations, what power or powers from Munford are you able to infer from those actors? So again, based off of who the people are, what their roles are, thinking about their motivations, do you think that they would be somebody who wants to do that power over, power with, or the mixed that Munford really talks about? And I wonder what evidence can you use to defend your thoughts there. And then tying together chapter 12, if you were the evaluator of this policy, what evidence would you be looking for that would tell you that this was effective? And then what evidence, if any, would be considered red flags that the policy is not effective? And then also, what are the unintended consequences that you predict that could come from this policy? So thinking a little bit about those policies, and again, tying together. Again, if we were in class, we would be doing this activity together and in small groups and having some discussion about it. Again, I wanted to leave this in here for you so that if you wanted to, you could choose to use this as a point of reference for yourself when reflecting on either my presentation or the readings. So Alexander chapter 13 really ties it all together. For me, when I read chapter 13, I really felt like I really honed in on the driving values that is on page 195. And I started to think about what are my own values when it comes to the white paper. I still struggle a little bit with some of the other policies and feeling like my perceived power is less than I know that I'm learning that it is. And so really with chapter 13, I really started to reflect on the white paper and what are my values? What are my driving values to why I'm interested in the policy that I want to address through my group's white paper. And so I kind of started to think about then, well, what is motivating me to make that change? And are my motives altruistic, personal, or mixed? And this is where I really started to think about the other reflection question of, is it possible to be one or the other, or is it always going to be some form of mixed, and whatever that ratio looks like? I really feel like that ratio, well, first of all, I feel like it's never going to be one or the other, because I feel like even if you have your own personal agenda, people who have personal agendas that are really horrible really believe that they're helping somebody, or really believe that, even if it's that they believe that they're helping themselves, which to me adds in that little bit of altruistic as well in there. So I really feel like it's always going to be mixed, but that the ratio is going to shift depending on the topic. So that's kind of where I stand. Those are my thoughts. I guess I shouldn't say that's where I stand, because if we were able to discuss it a little bit more, some of you all may have some really great points that might shift my thinking a little bit or make me think a little bit deeper about that. But that's where my thinking is right now, tonight. I also wonder, what roles have I previously played in regards to my particular policy? So what roles have you previously played in regards to your white paper policy? I wonder how class and working through the white paper has changed your role and your own perceived power. Has this process of working on the white paper shifted your motives or your motivation? Has it shifted your roles? Has it shifted your perceived power? Lastly, I found this quiz. It's an online quiz on leadership, and it identifies 5 motivations for people at work, specifically about leadership. So what motivates people to be leaders at work is kind of the premise behind this online quiz. And the website talks about 5 motivations that they believe people have at work. So achievement, power, affiliation, security, and adventure. I thought some of these fit into some of the themes, again, of our motivation, and also some of the themes throughout the articles as well. I will tell you that at the end, it does ask for an email before it gives you your results. However, I did take the quiz, and it was interesting to read my results. And I started thinking about it in different context of, yes, work, because my position in work is as a vice principal. So I did think about what that looks like in work. But then I also began to think about, what does it look like in my work with how I choose to engage in policy at work, and then also how my motivations for this program for grad school and through the doctoral program. I started to kind of evaluate different aspects of just the different things that I do, or the things that I'm involved in, and really looked at my motivations to see how it applied across the board. And it was interesting. It was an interesting personal reflection. So I thought I would just share that with you. I'm not sure that you're able to click on the link through this presentation. So when I send this email out, I will be sure that the link is included there. And then last, I just wanted to remind you all that, again, for class credit, when you have gotten to the end, you do need to submit this was from straight from Dr. Alaman's email, a one-page single-spaced reaction paper to the readings and my presentation by Friday. And he asked, Dr. Alaman asked that we send that via email so that we can get credit for the class. So thank you all very much for allowing me to present in this way. I hope that you all have found it to be useful. And again, if you ever want to use Explain Everything for something that you need to do either in class or for work, or just let me know. I'll be happy to help you walk through the process. It's super easy, though. I bet you could figure it out. But if not, I'll be happy to help. Thank you all again, and have a great night.